Say hello yet. Yeah. All right. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to our information session, which is about the wastewater treatment plant. The proposal that has been mooted, but is very much at an early stage. The council has been briefed on this, but we haven't as a board yet. So Adam Toos is here from the wastewater treatment plant to give us a bit of an update. And once again, Adam, I want to acknowledge the amazing and very difficult job that you're doing in keeping the plant running amidst many challenges and working in the stench as well. So thank you, and just want to remind everyone, including people watching at home, that Adam runs a plant and his job to deal with the consequences of what has happened and to manage that. So thank you, Adam, and over to you.
Cool, thank you very much. So what I've done is I put together a presentation. This was very close to the presentation that was presented to councillors early last week. What I'll do is I'll run through it and then take questions at the end, and then if need be I can run back through the presentations to any various slides of interest and stuff like that. So just as an intro, thank you very much for that, Paul. So nothing has been confirmed or agreed. Just because the bypass pipe has been muted does not mean it is definitely going to go ahead. We still need to work through a number of concepts, designs, impacts, resource consents, and get approval from council to go ahead. There's a lot to do before anything is concrete and definitely goes ahead. What I can say is the concept and preliminary design for the diversion pipe is underway. There's a number of council staff working on that plan together. What this update is today is to provide more details around the concept of the pond diversion proposal. I've also got a high-level legal position on that, which is in relation to the types of consents that we may need to do to get on it. That is not my area of expertise. I'm going to essentially repeat what's on the slides verbatim, and that's going to be the limit of my knowledge. And again, if we can hold questions till the end, that'll be awesome. So the agenda. Going to look into a tiny little bit of the background of why we're here and previous considerations of where we have considered diversion around the ponds in the past. What's the rationale for a pond bypass? Why are we even considering it? What would that diversion look like and how would it operate? What is the impacts and the risks of that diversion pipe? And go into a little bit of detail, because I know it's a topic that's been in the media, is around the options for disinfection. So that's the chlorine. So a tiny little bit of background. Obviously, you're well aware that you had the trickling filters lost in the fire in 2021. We installed a temporary activated sludge plant in early 22. Late 22, we installed 16 aerators on pond 1. And 2028 is when the new activated sludge plant is forecast to be completed. So that is to replace the full treatment capacity that was lost when we lost the trickling filters. So, believe it or not, diverting around the ponds is not a new concept. Every single time you consider a large upgrade at the CWTP, you have to consider a whole range of options. So do you do nothing? Do you renew it? Do you replace it? Do you have to do something different? So diversion around the ponds has been considered previously. In 2006 with the ocean outfall, when that was put in, there was consideration, do you need the ponds? Can we just go straight to the outfall? But it was looked at and decided that yes, we needed to keep the ponds. In 2018, when we were considering the impact of the midges on the surrounding community, again, we looked at the idea that we could maybe divert around the ponds, but instead we went for the midge management programme, which is tackling the various different stages of the midge life cycle. So as far we could do better than that, than the cost of what it was to divert all the way around the ponds. In early 2021, before we put the temporary activated sludge plant in, again, we looked at all options, including bypassing the ponds. And again, it was decided that no, the temporary activated sludge plant was the preferred option in that case. And again, we looked at all options in 2021, and aerators on the ponds was a preferred option as opposed to diverting around them. So each time the pond diversion was not selected due to other options having restrictions, environmental benefits, ability to implement stuff like that. The biggest risk of diverting around the ponds is what comes out the back of the CWTP has a lot of fecals and enterococci, which is harmful to human health. That is the big thing that stops us from typically diverting around the ponds. However, previously we haven't considered diverting around the ponds. This time there's a lot of noise about why we could be diverting around the ponds. So what has changed this time that's different? Legislation has. So on the left-hand side there is a screenshot of the Water Services Regulations Act 2025. What that did was propose standard wastewater limits, which are significantly more relaxed than the CWTP consent discharge limits. So whereas the current consent we have to discharge the environment, the limit might be down here, under the new wastewater standards, there's the option to go a lot looser. So you're allowed to discharge more contaminants to the environment. So I appreciate this is a bit texty, but I just wanted to make sure all details there. Obviously, everyone's got a copy of the PowerPoint if they want it. In the top left-hand side is the relevant extract from the Water Services Act about discharging into an open ocean environment, which is what we have here with the ocean outfall. And there's the legal text of what's in there about what the limits are. And on the right-hand side in those two boxes is the extract from our current resource consent, which details the level of contaminants that are allowed to go out in our existing CWTP consent. And that consent runs till 2041. The summary table at the bottom just is the comparison of it. So in the column on the left-hand side is the normal parameters which you consider, which you're allowed to discharge out, which is total suspended solids, ammonia, BOD, enterococci, and fecals. The middle column is what is allowed under the new Water Services Act wastewater standards limits for an ocean environment. So for example, taking the top one, total suspended solids, you're allowed to discharge up to 100 milligrams per litre as median and 150 for the 90th percentile, which when you compare it to the TSS in our current resource consent, you can see it's 2-3 times looser than what we're allowed to. Ammonia, 10 milligrams per litre looser. BOD, our current consent only allows us to discharge 20 milligrams per litre of BOD. Under the wastewater standards, there's no BOD limit. Enterococci, the current limits we have under our resource consent in terms of CFUs is 1,000 to 5,000. Under the new wastewater standard limits, that's 40,000. And with the fecals, again, our current consent says 1,500, whereas under the new Water Services Act limits, it doesn't apply. So when they did the Water Services Act, they looked at putting those wastewater standards in, and as you can see, they're a lot more lax. So when we have to consider all options about issues of dealing with smells by the pond, the potential of diverting around the ponds is a real legitimate option that has to be considered. So these are now the legal slides. So if we were to put a diversion straight in around the ponds, it would have impacts and consequences, and the discharges that will be going out, even though the new standards of the wastewater standards are looser, and we could look to apply under those, you still need to go through a consenting process. And again, this is stepping outside my full knowledge. This is what the lawyer put together for us. So emergency powers under the existing Resource Management Act. So this is not the Water Services Act, this is the existing Resource Management Act. They have deemed that the emergency powers under that do not apply. And the reasons are listed there. So in highlight, it has to be a state of danger that is unexpected with immediacy and urgency. The time it will take to put as a diversion pipe in takes more than that. So under technical definitions, we can't really apply under that one. You're aware under the new government, you're allowed to make fast track applications. It's been deemed that that's not useful here. It's too slow. You have to go through consultation, then you have to apply to the minister, and then you have to go to a panel. And for our case, it probably doesn't meet the threshold of being significantly regional or national benefit. What we could do is look at a variation or a new resource consent for the diversion aspect. So we do not seek to change the existing resource consent for the current one that we've got. So that our resource consent that runs to 2041, you keep that as it is. You do, however, seek a new resource consent for the lesser water quality standard for the nominal 30 amount of flow to be diverted around it. If that diverted 30% complies with the wastewater environmental performance standards, then cannot impose tighter standards than that what's listed there before. So this is what the channel that we appear to be going down. Is there risks associated with this proposed diversion around the ponds from a legal perspective? Possibly. So ECAN unhelpful, it's unlikely. Yes, they've given us abatement notice, but they have verbally indicated, had multiple meetings with us, they are willing to try and do what they can to do to be helpful. But they have a job to do, and so do we. In terms of notified, submitted and opposition, I'll just let you read that bit verbatim. And again, sorry, should be number 3 at the bottom. ECAN decided to use a land use consent for the whole of the wastewater treatment plant delays. What that means is we currently do not have a land use consent for the operation of the CWTP. So that's something we're working through anyway before all this started. All that's been highlighted is you could delay the process ever so slightly, but that's something they could work through, but just to be open and honest with what's going on. So why is a bypass required now? Since 2021, it's been quite a long time. The amount of flow and load that have been sent into the ponds has been higher than what it was with the trickling filters. So what that means is the ponds have lost their resilience and are becoming more and more susceptible to CWTP performance fluctuations and weather conditions. So back in 2021, 2022, the ponds were still very resilient. They were maturation ponds, slowly converting back to oxidation ponds. After 4 years of sending that high load, the ponds are just becoming less resilient to it. So when we do get high loading events and weather conditions exacerbate it, that's what's resulting in these more significant odor events. We're still 2.5 years away from the new activated sludge plant being commissioned. We do need to recognise that we need to mitigate future odour incidences. We have received that abatement notice from ECAN. We need to act. The CWTP has been operating at maximum capacity and minimum redundancy. So, the tanks that have been in service are now beyond the maintenance intervals that are normally required. So, if you remember from a lot of the early photographs, we had those 4 settlement tanks and we turned 2 into aeration basins and 2 as clarifiers. Because we've been running those absolutely flat out and hard, it means we haven't been able to go in, take the tank offline and do the essential maintenance on it. So we're pushing those assets harder and deferring that maintenance program. The CWTP effluent and quality of the ponds will also be required to drop in future to allow essential enabling works, ASP. So, for example, the majority of the build for the new activated sludge plant, we've got a temporary fence up. The contractor is behind that fence line, building that asset as quickly as it can, as possible as it can. At some point, they're going to have to physically reconnect into our existing structures. So we're going to have to connect in to the flow that's coming out of the primary tanks to send it to the new activated sludge plant. And we're going to have to connect the back end of the activated sludge plant back into the clarifiers. So at some points, we're going to have to make some pretty hefty tie-ins into the current temporary process. And when you do that, obviously, we can't send the flow through it instantaneously. That takes time to happen. So we will have to bypass the ponds with some of those heavier loads. So what would a pond bypass look like? So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see our oxidation ponds, and you can see the blue arrows there, which show the path through the oxidation ponds. So the big one on the left is where it comes into pond 1. It then goes up a bit into pond 2A, 2B, under the state highway, ponds 3, 4, 5, 6, into that circle, which is our ocean outfall pump station. It shoots across the estuary, up Jellicoe Street, and then disappears out there. So that is what the pond diversion bypass would look like from a high aerial level. What would it actually look like on the ground? What would you see if you're driving past the site? So that's on Cuthbert's Road. So if you're driving from left to right, the CWTP will be on your left and the ponds will be on the right. We've already got those 2 pipes disappearing under the road. So the diversion at this point, you wouldn't notice anything different. It's all using existing infrastructure that's already underground. What we then do is we would use that pipe there where it says existing pipe to pond 4. So some of my predecessors had the right instinct to put bypass pipes in, and that one runs straight from the CWTP all the way into pond 4. So it goes from CWTP under Cuthbert's, under pond 1, under the state highway into pond 4, which allows pond 1 to be taken offline, and then you can drain it, empty it of sludge, and for normal operational maintenance. So that is the pipe that is proposed to be used. At the end of that pipe, what's proposed is you break into that pipe somehow. Apologies, I'm not a civil engineer, hence why it's a red box. They'll break into that pipe and using pumps and pipes, they'll make a connection into it. So they intercept it and then they will pump it, shooting straight up. So in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture where the big, thick red dotted line is, that's your break into the pipe, and then it will connect it into an overland pipe that's going to be secured onto the ground. I understand it's going to be a 630 millimetre internal diameter pipe, about that big. And it's going to run from there all the way up alongside the state highway, across the top of Pond 3, round to the right, run around the top of Pond 6, and then drop into the ocean outfall pump station. So if you want to see anything on the diversion, that's what it would be. It'll be a pipe secured on the ground, running along the state highway. Running along our path, the far side of the state highway. When it gets to the ocean outfall, details not confirmed. Somehow it will discharge into the ocean outfall, and then it will use the existing ocean outfall pipe, which you can see is that big red dotted line. So it goes through those few chambers, disappears under the estuary, does a slight left turn, runs under Jellicoe Street, under the sand dunes, and then disappears out to sea. So in the New Brighton area, you will not see any difference. You won't see any temporary pipe work above the ground or anything like that. And yeah, just a nice aerial shot of it as well. Where is the discharge actually coming out into the ocean? So what this aerial image is showing is just size for a bit of context. So top of the picture, you can see New Brighton Pier. If you measure the pier using Google, not accurate, from where it comes out the library all the way to the very end, it's a nominal 320 metres. The ocean outfall is shown on the bottom. So from the sand dunes all the way to the very edge of the pipe is 3.2 kilometres all the way out. So it's a factor of 10 longer than the pier of what's going out. Big pipe that goes out, where does it actually come out the end of that pipe? Slightly technical as-built drawing, but what I'm trying to show here, in the top left-hand corner, that lumpy bit is the height of the New Brighton sand dunes. So you can see that's where it disappears underneath there. And then across the bottom in green, it shows that it's 3 kilometres from the sand dune all the way out to the 2 yellow highlighted bits. Those 2 yellow highlighted bits is where the diffusers are on the end of the pipe, so where the effluent from that pipe actually reaches out into the sea. So it goes a full 3 kilometres all the way to the almost the very end of the pipe, and then over the last 360 metres of that pipe, there's 13 diffusers, which is where the effluent is actually discharged into the receiving environment. So no discharge is discharged anywhere closer to the coast than that minimum of 3 kilometres. And again, just for context, piers in the very top left, as you can see it, and in the bottom right, that little white arrow is roughly indicative of where that effluent has been released out into the ocean. So it's 3 kilometres away from the beach. So what is the impact of the pond bypass? Sorry, pond diversion. The diversion would allow for a component of the flow from the back end of the CWTP to be diverted all the way around to the ocean outfall. So it's to take a proportion of that flow and bypass the pond systems completely. What that would allow to do is for the ponds to receive lower flow and lower load, which would allow them to return to closer to normal operating parameters. If we can get the ponds in a lower load, lower flow environment, they should return better performance and should not produce as much as odours. However, if we're bypassing that load all the way past the ponds, what does that mean? So it does mean that there's going to be higher organic loading in the ocean outfall in terms of BOD, total suspended solids, and an ammonia. So we have done some preliminary analysis, so it's not verified yet. It's just high-level figures and numbers. We're going to have to work through them in more detail. But it is anticipated that as a combined blend, so you've got the normal flow coming through the pond to the ocean outfall. You then got this component of flow which is being picked up from the CWTP, joins in at the ocean outfall. What then is going out into the ocean environment will meet the wastewater environmental performance standards for the high energy ocean environment. So that is where I say we can look at doing this discharge under the new WEPs. There's 2 components to what we're sending out. One is the increased organic load, The second one is the nasties, which is the fecals, the entococci, and the E. coli. These are the things that in the environment, if you get it into yourself, it can make you ill. The only way you can get them to the safe limit under the WEPs is to provide some form of disinfection. Stepping slightly back away from the diversion aspect, the ponds provided all the disinfection treatment it needed naturally. So all the fecals, entococci, E. coli that was coming out at the back end of the CWTP untreated were fully disinfected by the time it gets to the ocean outfall pump station. How did it do that? Natural UV radiation from the sunlight, natural predation from other bacteria and algae. So fecals, entococci, and E. coli, they're the stuff that lives inside your body. They like it where it's nice and protected. If you put them in an open pond environment, they don't last long. They get eaten up by other stuff. And the other thing is they naturally settle out. You've got between 17 and 30 days retention time in the pond. That allows a lot of the time for those stuff to just settle out naturally in the bottom of the ponds. If we're diverting around their ponds, we need to replace that disinfection and treatment process. We cannot put any diversion treatment process in place with no disinfection. We will not meet the WEPs and we put bacteria out to the sea, which has human health consequences. We have to put a disinfection process in place. So what are the disinfection options? At a very, very high level, you can do those things listed on the left-hand side, which is you throw chlorine at it. You throw chlorine at it, but then you add a dechlorination stage. You haven't got the free available chlorine causing impacts in the receiving environment. You can put peracetic acid into it. You can add ozone to it, or you can run it through in a UV plant. And then what the table show on the right-hand side is what the CapEx, how much does it cost to put that equipment in? The deployment speed. If we decide to go with this disinfection approach, how quickly can we get it out there, power, connect it in, put foundations in, do all the testing, flows, etc., to get it working. Turbidity tolerance. So if you put chlorine in or chemical or something like that, it mixes quite readily free through the column. If you're trying to treat it with UV, if it's quite turbid, so it's not particularly clear, some of the bugs and bacteria can hide behind those little bits and pieces, not quite as effective. The next big one is the disinfection byproducts risk. So if you add chlorine, chlorine reacts with the organics and it forms something called disinfection byproducts. Because there's a whole range of different organic materials in there, it forms a whole different range of disinfection byproducts. And that's not particularly great. In terms of operational complexity, again, whether stuff's nice and easy to put in or whether it's quite difficult and complex. So a consultant has been engaged to undertake a high-level feasibility study of all these options, and that is going to be returned to us, and then we're going to look at it ourselves in-house and then present that to the councillors as well. So why was chlorination the initial option that was discussed and put out there into the media? It's rapid to deploy. Typically in public health emergencies, it's the first easiest thing that you jump to. It's pretty easy to do. It is a proven wastewater disinfection. If you add it to wastewater in the right concentrations, it will kill all the nasty bugs and bacteria that are in there to make sure human health is not affected. We've got quite a lot of staff that are experienced with operating chlorine systems within council. It is a proven reliable pathogen reduction, so it can meet the new consent limits, and it is effective in the turbid, partially treated wastewater. So if we go back to a step, diversion is taking a component to the flow that's coming out the back end of the CWTP. The temporary activator sludge plant is only capable of treating about 3/4 of the flow that comes through the treatment plant. So all the stuff that's coming out the CWTP and going into the ponds, it's not fully treated. There's still a component there. So that's where the chlorine is particularly good and is partially treated to making sure it tackles everything that's in there. And it's simple to integrate and operationally it's very easy to control. If the diversion pumps are pumping, it gets a signal, the chlorine dose says, oh, they're pumping, I need to add something into it. It's reasonably simple. However, as discussed, there are significant risks of use of chlorination. So as I touched on before, if the chlorine is dosing, because it's getting a confused signal if things the pumps are doing, and it's putting a whole load of chlorine into it, It may be that it's going into that pipe, it's getting all the way to pond 4 and the pumps aren't operating, and it's going to end up with a whole load of chlorine going into the ponds. Chlorine doesn't just kill bugs and bacteria, it tends to be pretty good at killing everything that's out there as well. The last thing you want to do is to dump a whole load of chlorine into my ponds and cause them to die. The other thing that might be happening is the bypass pumps are pumping, but for whatever reason, the chlorine dose isn't working, which means that the partially treated wastewater will be going out to the ocean without disinfection, which increases that public health risk. So those are the two real big ones. The other ones are, the next one is slightly more localized, chemical safety risk. The amount of chlorine you have to add up will have to be quite significant, which means you're going to need big storage tanks to hold it. Environmental toxicity. Residual chlorine can be harmful to aquatic life if not controlled. So again, that's what the consultants are looking at into a bit more detail for us. Disinfection byproducts, as touched on before, you add chlorine, it reacts with the organics, it causes disinfection byproducts.
Can you just, so that, I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing what I preach here in waiting, but the DBPs are something that I'm, particularly concerned about.
Yes.
And it's, well, can you explain more about them and why they're a risk?
No.
Because some of them are carcinogenic, right?
So it is nasty, and it is something that can be there. It's all about the rate of diffusion in the receiving environment. What we're putting out there is a reasonably small amount, and you're getting some significant diffusion with the flow that's coming all the way down through, and you are discharging 3 kilometres offshore. However, that's what we've packaged up, provided all that information, pass that across to a consultant, and that will come back in a format that will be properly done. All I'm doing here is high level, this is the risks, this is just providing more information, and there'll be more information to come on that.
Right, thanks.
Operational dependency, to make sure we get the right kill, we have to make sure we've got the correct dosing limits, the correct monitoring on it, and also make sure the system's interlocking so we don't get those two scenarios. In addition to the diversion around the ponds, we're also looking at a second project, which is progressing in parallel to that, and that is to put additional aerators on ponds 2A and 2B. At the moment, majority of the flow, majority of the time goes into pond 1. We want it to go into that one because that's where all the aerators are, and that allows us to put a lot of oxygen in to do the treatment. What we found with the high flow, that's just simply been overwhelmed. So we have the ability to split the flow. We can send a portion of the flow to 2A, a portion of the flow to 2B. We put aerators on there. So we provide some of the treatment in there, and it reduces the flow and load into pond 1, and that gets it back within its normal operating parameters. So by putting additional aerators on 2A and 2B, it allows us to take the load off pond 1. This will allow the flow and load to do the additional treatment for us and allow ponds 3, 4, 5, and 6 to return to the maturation state that we had pre-fire. CCC staff have been working with a consultant and have developed a technical specification. You can't just say, give me some aerators. We need to go out to the market and say, with a bit of science behind it, what aerators we need, how many kilowatts, where they want to be, etc. And we've also had to do the flow and load scenario to make sure we're requesting enough aerator to go on there, what proportion of flow and load to be able to treat. And we've got in contact with an aeration supplier, and there's discussions ongoing. And yes, just some aerial images of the jet boat that was in action at the peak of the Oda event. And I'll open it to questions.
I'll start off with some questions and then go to Jackie's got her hand up first. And some of these have been provided very helpfully by Don Phil, who's sitting behind you. So what would be the approximate timeline to build and commission the bypass?
I haven't got those things to me at the moment. All I can say is it's big. We are working on it. There's a number of staff working on it, consultants and contractors. But I'm unable to give a date at this time, I'm afraid.
So that means you couldn't say the earliest realistic date for it could be. So what are the steps before we know some of that information?
So I'm operations, I don't do capital delivery, I'm afraid. So my understanding is you have to come up with a concept. We've got a concept, we're still working on how much flow we want to get through it, for example. Do we want to get 300 litres, 600, 1200 litres a second for it? If you do that, then that determines how big the pumps are, how big the pipe has to be. You then need to do your preliminary design, which says, right, so we know how big the pumps need to be, so we know how big the power is, we know whether it's got to go, we know what shoring we've got to do, what foundations we've got to put in place. And then also, if you know the flows, you then have to work out what your disinfection treatment process is and all the associated stuff with that. So once you've got your preliminary design, you're going to have to do some high-level detail design. I appreciate this wants to go in, so it probably won't have the full dot the I's, cross the T's of a full capital delivery project, but we will be utilising some of those skills and abilities and documentation to make sure the project goes in, succeeds in terms of what it's supposed to do, i.e. won't fail prematurely and stuff like that. So we will be following a process, but it will be fast-tracked, as it were.
So you've got sort of a high level comparative estimates, but so can you give us a sense of how much untreated or partially treated wastewater will actually be discharged?
That's being worked on at the moment.
That's what you're working on, so you can't give an indication of flow rate or actual pollutant loads?
Not at this time, no.
Or how often even the bypass would operate?
Correct.
Yep.
So there's two aspects of that. So if you put aerators on, you won't need to use your bypass as much. If you go for the diversion option, then you're likely to use it, send more flow down it, send it down for longer.
Do you have any sense of what the real human health risk would be at beaches?
I think it will be very, very clear that we do not want to cause any increase in human health as to any risk of human health increase as a result of what's going out the outfall, correct?
And so has there been modelling, or and I assume if there hasn't, there will be modelling done on pathogen levels or likely pathogen levels at the beach?
Council will want to be very, very sure we're not increasing any risk to human health as a consequence of what's going out the outfall.
And so I would assume then, hopefully, that there would be real-time monitoring of that.
That's all to be decided and confirmed. We will have so ECAN is the regulator. They'll be the one that's issuing the consent of what goes out to the outfall. Yeah. And so in terms of, because you've sort of mapped out broadly the difference in time for the possible options, we'll go back to the so to someone see them there next time. So sorry, yes.
Yeah, so we've got sort of like the, you know, low, medium, very high, and very fast. Like at the moment, like we don't have any way of gauging what is meant by those things.
No. So I can give a bit of an example. So chlorine would be a big tank with a pipe coming out of it with a little pump on, and that pump will be controlled by a flow signal, which you get in from the diversion pump. So diversion pump saying pumping sends a signal. That pump says, that's pumping, I need to pump as well. And it'll have a set rate. It says, I know if that's pumping, I need to provide this much. And it'll just start pumping, and go down the pipe, and it'll be ejected into the pipeline. As soon as the pump stops, it'll go stop, and that'll stop. So the costs associated with a tank, with a pump, with a bit of electronics, a bit of signal, a bit of safety interlocking, necessarily bunding and spill control around it. That's it. It's not significant. If you go to the other end where you need to create an ozone creation unit, so you're talking a designed shipping container, for example, with an ozone generation unit with great big powers to it, great big controls to it, and then all the flow and all the controls that goes into it, that's not as easy as getting a tank with some sodium hypochlorite in it.
You know, my final question, because I'm also going to ask you about the DPs, but what are the risks in terms of being able to maintain service to, you know, to because currently you're running at somewhere near 100% or over 100% of capacity of the plant. And, yes. And as you said earlier, you've been pushing the plant very hard, and there is maintenance on the bearings and things that needs to happen. So, and sort of suggested that this will allow, having the bypass available will allow opportunity to do that maintenance. So what would have you done without this option, and what are the risks to the operation of the plant if this option isn't, or something similar doesn't proceed?
As a high level, if we don't do anything, the chances of odor events to be more frequent and more severe.
So what was the plan before?
It was to see how long we could keep everything going until the new activated sludge plant was going in, but it's become obvious as we go down the odor events and more severe odor events means that we need to act.
Okay, so there are really these two aspects to considering this as a project for the council. Just remind people that the community board doesn't get to make our mind up on it. Is that you've got the risk, you've got the stench.
Yes.
And then you've got the possible failure of the plant because the actual plant breaks. And so there needs to be something that takes strain off the plant in order to do that. So that really adds something more that hasn't really been discussed in public as much as if that really is, if that's a big factor.
Yes.
And that's something that needs to be weighed up. And I mean, I'll say, this isn't a question, it's a statement. I feel very uneasy about the whole proposal, given the potential environmental impact and lots of other unknowns. But I do think that it needs to be investigated fully. And I'll also note, before I go to you, Jackie, that it's very clear that having an idea is the easy bit, and then actually implementing any of these things is going to take significant time. Jackie, and then Greg.
If I can just pick up on that, I tried to sort of explain it at the start. So in terms of impact on the environment, as long as the proportion of the flow that's diverted isn't excessive, we should be able to meet the Water Services Act. So when that's gone through, it's gone through.
Yes, but that's the standard has been massively dropped. If you look at those numbers, really significantly dropped. Like, yes, we'll be able to hopefully make the new lower standard. And like back in 2006, I submitted on the ocean outfall plan, and I thought that what we went with wasn't good enough for environmental reasons. And now we're looking at the standards have been lowered. So I mean, you've got operational realities that your job is to deal with those. But the bigger picture is, we don't want to try and solve one problem. We don't want to solve one problem and cause more problems. And I know that there's no perfect solution, but this is that we're only potentially going to make a lower standard is very worrying. Yes. Yeah.
I'd just like you to correct me if I've got this wrong, but earlier you said that when the new sludge plant comes on, you need this diversion then as well?
Temporarily while we make the connections into it, yes.
But that would be a similar diversion to the one we're proposing at this time?
No, sorry. It will be, I've got a nice image somewhere. I think I have. Sorry, normally I've got a nice image of the wastewater treatment plant somewhere, which of course I haven't got. So if you can imagine where the trickling filters were, basically there's a pipe that goes past it, which then goes into temporary activated sludge plant, stuff like that. When we do the bypass, we just have to bypass the trickling filter, bypass the temporary activated sludge plant to make the new connection to the new waste P at the front end and the new connection.
So that's not a case with diverting it?
No, so when I say bypass while we create the new HP up, that's an internal bypass within the CWTP band, not the ponds.
That's fine, thank you.
Greg.
Do you have any idea how long it would take for the pond health to recover sufficiently?
Going right back to 2021, when we looked into this, there is no comparable global event where we've lost a secondary treatment process to try and understand what was happening with the ponds system. We have learned a lot over the years. It's taken a long time to get to this stage where the ponds have demonstrated they consistently struggle with variations in load and variations in weather. In terms of restoration, it's a bit of an unknown. However, what I would say, if you go down the aeration route, we will be designing to have a fairly high level of aeration. If you are able to keep the dissolved oxygen levels positive, which of course is what we are, if you cause it to be positive, it prevents the anaerobic conditions which result in the hydrogen sulfide generation. What it also does is it means there's plenty of dissolved oxygen level in the ponds in order to have the aerobic breakdown of the sludge that's in the bottom of the ponds. So in theory, if you put the aerators in, it will break that sludge down quicker. If you put the diversion around and do it that way, you're taking the flow and the load off, but you won't be putting the aeration into it. So the sludge that's in there will be breaking down at its normal rate of breakdown, which we don't quite know how quickly that will be. But it's likely to be slower than if you'd put aeration on. What we have got, and I've touched in previous meetings regarding to the CWTP update, we have got the PhD student who's going round, and if I ever showed you the pictures of the drone boat, that is going out regularly, and we're getting lots and lots of sludge data. We can far better than probably any other oxidation pond site in the country in terms of how frequently we are monitoring their sludge levels to see how they are responding to when we put the new aerators on, when we divert flow around the ponds, the variation in the seasons. So we will know far more going into it going forward than where we have today.
You also see around times when pond one's had its sludge removed. Do you have an estimate on the timeframes of the next time that would need to happen?
No, my understanding is at the moment the capital programme is to focus on the priorities, get the new activated sludge plant built, and then get all the other grades associated with it to allow that to function at its maximum capability, and also the sludge digesters to make sure they're up to spec. So the new activated sludge plant will generate a little bit of extra sludge. We need to make sure the rest of the site is capable of handling that. And then once that's up and running, the new SP up and running, the quality going to the ponds will be as it was when we had the trickling filters. And the amount of odours we had from the ponds pre-trickling filter fire was minimal. So we used to have occasional odours from the CWTP. The ponds were very, very rare where they generated any significant odour. So new SP in, the pond should return to being happy.
No, I'll leave for now and come back to all the Thomas.
Celeste.
Thanks, Adam. Just wondering around the sort of timeframes and stuff, because we've heard it referred to as temporary, and I understand that's the intention, but is it correct, I think it was in the slide, that the other consent variation would require us to have that in place for 35 years? So technically, we could get that in place for 35 years.
I will default to what's in the slide as provided by the lawyer. I'm very sorry.
So there would be a risk we should be aware of that the temporary division could become a permanent division if future council so decided.
Again, I'll just refer straight to what's on the slide, please.
So if it does end up being temporary, best case scenario is sort of end of 2028 is what we're thinking. Timelines wise, I mean,
Like looking at 20 timeframes at this moment in time. This is just to provide an update on what it would look like and information about it. Yes, timeframes I'm leaving out, I'm afraid, for the moment.
So it's probably all legal questions really around the consent, around what safeguards we can put in place to make it temporary. Again, I'm not sure if you can answer this, but I'll just ask anyway. With the original consent, we would have done a whole bunch of modelling around this. I think they call it sort of plume modelling, which is where it spreads. Do we have it? Can we get copies of that information so we can understand where the current discharge spreads through into?
Yes, that'll be a copy in the assessment of environmental effects, which would have gone in as part of the consent process. Bearing in mind that the modelling from back in 2006 was probably substantially better now.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that as part of the new consent variation, we would be doing that kind of detailed modelling.
Again, I'll defer on that, I'm afraid. I can only provide dates on.
Because I was led to understand that detailed analysis wouldn't be done in this case. So I just wanna, I guess it'd be good to get clarification of what additional information we'll be getting that won't be high level,
Yeah.
so to speak. And I'll just go for one more because I know Yanni's waiting, but in terms of the marine ecosystem,
Yes.
might be outside of the scope, but will we be looking at getting further information around that? Like in terms of the consultant that we've employed, have we employed a consultant that can look across different areas of concerns, or will we be doing it strictly in relation to the?
So we've engaged consultants for the different aspects of what their speciality is in. So we'll go to one of the sort of wastewater specialists and civil specialists to look at one of the builders. In terms of the impacts on the receiving environment, yes, we'll probably go to a different consultant to look at that. But we are having lots of active conversations with ECAN, and they have indicated they are wanting to be as helpful as possible with it. So I imagine that would come out of those high level conversations there, and they would help inform us of what we need to do in order to get those consents.
And I will second one more with the numbers around it, sort of talk about chlorination versus the other options as being low, medium, high in terms of cost. In terms of CapEx.
That's about the limit.
Okay, so for that to be coming back to council as part of the decision report.
Yes.
Yeah.
There'll be more numbers in that report, yes.
Be a lot of work with that pretty soon. Because when do you know when that decision report is coming to council?
No, I don't. It's the next couple of weeks, I believe. All I will say is this is, apart from the immediate aftermath of the fire, I have never had so many staff from so many different parts of Three Waters all come together to work on something as quickly and as hard as this in the past 6 or 7 years. With council staff have really pulled out all the stops to respond to everything that's going on there.
All right, Yanni, and then I've got some questions.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry, just to be clear, do you mean since the proposal was announced?
It's been a lot of work over the past few weeks to get all the information together, to respond to all the queries, the contacts, to pull together the proposal with pulling all the numbers together to get all the numbers from the contacts. Yes.
And I really appreciate that you're here briefing the community. I asked the board gets briefed as local elected members. It has felt like we've been on the outside. So I guess when I hear your presentation and you talk about the aerator proposal, I'm trying to understand what risk planning was done and why the work's only starting now when we've had such bad problems in the past and even a couple of months ago. So was it only because ECAN gave us abatement notice, or was this planning that was going on to mitigate the risk before that?
If you look at the frequency and the intensities, the earlier events since the fire, I'll acknowledge that they have increased. But whatever we do here will be a multi-million-dollar solution that goes in. So we have been able to go a number of months at times when we haven't had early events, and it's a case of working through what the balance is and whether we need to do it or not. And it's obviously got to the stage now where it's blatantly obvious we have had to do it, and we have been working on that.
Okay, so I was keen to know, we haven't applied for the consent yet, have we, to ECAN?
I will say there's a lot of ongoing discussions, and what's in the slides is my understanding of the legal position.
And you may not be able to answer, and it's totally cool if you can't. When we went through the organics issue where we had thousands of complaints and similar issue, and we talked to ECAN and we said we want to get a new plant done, and we had a very ambitious timeframe for the consent. And that timeframe was not met anywhere close to, it basically delayed it for a year. I'm concerned that this project, if we look at the concern in the community around the environmental effects, and we don't know what the mana whenua view is, I think we were told that they were supportive initially, and now we've been told that they haven't been engaged and we're waiting their feedback. But putting that to one side, just in terms of the likelihood of getting a consent in a reasonable timeframe when we haven't been able to do so in the past, I'm just wondering how much effort we're putting into this, given the risk around not being able to get it done in time for the new activated sludge plant being up and running. Like, is there a risk that we spend all this time and effort looking at this option and we don't get progress on it to fix the problem ahead of when the new solution's in place?
Given the severity of the impact on the community, we need to consider all options.
Right, but if we spend a whole bunch of money doing something that's not going to be ready in time, what have we achieved?
I can't really comment on that. What I can say is staff are working hard to meet the expectations which has been set of us, which is to work on these two options.
And the aerator proposal, do we have a sense of what the cost and the time is for that? Like how soon could we?
I'm unable to comment on that. So from an operations update, what I can do is provide my operational scope, what is required in those aspects. So we've got all the flows, the load, the numbers, which are then passing on to others within CCC for them to size the proportion of the diversion of the bypass needed, and then for the aerator.
Just it's a, like, you know, I'm not an expert in the space, and there's people that are greater qualified. Just from a simple point of view, the concept of just adding more aerators to address the problem seems far simpler, far cheaper, far quicker for the same benefit. Like, am I missing something? Is there?
All the pros and cons and benefits will be provided in the report to councillors, so they have fully informed as to the decisions that they can make on the two options, not three options, four options.
Again, I don't know if you can answer this, but the consent, I don't know if you can put the consent slide back up.
So the
Cool. So is there any chance that the proposal could fit in within these consent limits?
No.
Zero chance of, sorry. So no chance at all that the proposed bypass could meet the current consent conditions?
So with the flow that's going through the ponds at the moment, we are fully compliant with our resource consent, which is everything on the right. If you put your diversion in, what's coming off the back of the CWT would exceed our current consent limit. So the TSS may jump. At the moment, TSS is quite low, but it will certainly exceed 50, but it shouldn't exceed the 100 and 150.
Okay.
So we can't, if we put the diversion in, I can't put the diversion in and meet my current resource consent discharge limits.
Okay.
Never mind. Just
two more quick questions from me. Thank you. It would seem apparent looking at the slide where you had the risk that the chlorine option seems to have the highest risk around the harm to the environment. The parasitic acid and the ozone seem, and again, I don't know, so it may be helpful. Cool. Yeah. So the parasitic acid one has the DPB risk is very low, operational complexity low, deployment speed fast. It seems like a sensible option. Is there? I mean, can we rule out chlorine now and just focus on one or two of these that are more, are less risky, and just as impactful?
When you consider all options, we consider all options. So these are all the proven wastewater treatment technologies that are available that are out there for disinfection. Right. So that's why they're all being presented as is with this very high level overview.
Okay, and then the final question from me, I mean, I've got lots of questions, I'll leave them through, but the final question from me is, we keep hearing about the problem with the load. And I'm just curious, who's the biggest generator of the load, and what steps, if the load's the problem, have we taken to look to reduce the amount of load coming into the plant? This is something that the community repeatedly.
It's a lot of questions, yeah.
I'll take that question away and we'll get back to you.
Cool, thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself there. So my question before we go to Kim is that, so we have a marine mammal sanctuary, which currently the outfall runs into. And so what consideration is being given to that? And also, there are rules within the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So even if a discharge meets the Water Services waste standards, regulators must still ensure the activity does not adversely affect protected habitats of Indigenous species under the Marine Mammals Protection Act, Banks Peninsula Marine Mammal Sanctuary Regulations, and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement Biodiversity Policies. And the estuary is also still a significant natural area. So what consideration has been given to all of those?
So Ideally, I'll take that question away and we can provide a fully fledged answer to it. However, what I would say is no doubt as part of the consenting process, all those will be considered and in discussion with ECAN.
Right. Thank you, Adam. Kim?
Here, thanks, Ellen. Just when you're talking about the aerators, just thinking about how many, and the report that you're going to get about the aerators, the maximum amount of aerators will be provided for pond 1 to 8B. So there's obviously so many that you put in there at once. So you're looking at.
It's quite complex. We'll carry on.
Okay. No, that was the question. You know, we will get the maximum if that was an option that council would consider.
Because of the flow and the lows that come in, it is quite significant. So if you aim to cover the vast majority of the flows, for example, if you decide we're going to cover 95% of flows, you put this many aerators in. What happens, and when we've looked at the data sets, is it's exponentially increasing in flow and loads as you go beyond that 95th percentile and go higher up. So to get from 95th percentile to 97th percentile, 2% increase in the overall time that you provide sufficient aeration, you almost have to double your aeration capacity. So you may have 10 aerators instead, you may need to put 20 in just to cover for that little extra bit over the top of it. And if you want to go to the 100%, you may have to put 4 or 5 times as many aerators in. So the complexity of sewage is you get what you get given. It can vary in flow and load significantly. But that's why you rely on the consultants with international experience, lots of knowledge and skills to provide the best that's there. The other thing as well, if you do aim for something that gives you 95% capacity, that means it's 45% of the time it's above what your average normal flow and load at. And to pick up on what Greg said before, if you've got those aerators there, they provide an excess oxygen in there, which allows for greater dissolved oxygen levels in there, which allows you to treat some of the sludge that's at the bottom, which improves the resilience for future flow and load. So if you do get a 96, 97, 98% flow event coming in, because you're being at 95% instead of the 50%, you've built up some resilience by treating that sludge that's in there. So when it comes in, even if it's at 96, 97, 98%, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to result in odour, because you pre-prep the ponds with your aerator to get some of that sludge load down at the bottom.
Thank you. The other last question was just about when you mentioned that chlorine, there was heavy chlorine tanks.
Yes.
So just making sure that with that comes smell, and making sure there's a firm lid on whatever.
Oh, yeah, the tank.
So make sure
yes.
they're not adding to the problem.
No.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, so that'll be third proper design of the plumbing units. Yes.
Thank you.
Good. Time for some more questions from Celeste, and then see how long those take.
Do we have any areas on order, and say how many in addition to what you're already proposing to purchase?
It's the proposal will be put to council for them to make a decision if we're going to go through the aerator route. At the moment, there is no additional aerators in order.
And this might seem like a stupid question, but how do we know that the ocean outfall approach, putting additional partially treated waste out, will actually fix the problem? Like, are we reasonably confident that that will be a fix as compared with another approach? And will that be the relative benefits of each in terms of how effective they are be presented in a report?
That's my understanding, yes. So I've been involved in reviewing some of those high level documentations as a peer review towards it. And yeah, there's a lot of assessment being undertaken of how much, what's the benefits, whether you send this flow, what's the benefit, if you send that flow, what's the benefit in terms of reducing the load on the ponds. But then conversely, if you send it more out, what will be the subsequent impact as well?
Yeah. And then in terms of the monitoring side of things, given that the new wastewater standards don't require us to monitor certain things like the BODs and fecal limits, will we be monitoring those even if it's not required under the consent?
That'll be as part of the discussion with ECAN in the consent process.
Okay, and then just final one, will you be increasing monitoring of the ponds as well? Is that something that's really happening as part of the new process? Will that be part of that?
We do have an extensive pond monitoring program. We test twice a week We go out, grab a whole load of samples from each and every pond and send it to the lab. And then 5 times a fortnight, we go around and we do other checks as well. So, for example, the lab sample will go out, they'll test BOD, COD, ammonia, TSS, algae, pH and temperature. So that's the lab samples. So all of those samples times 7, twice a week. And then engineers also go out as well, and they go up and send all the drone pictures. So if you see in the newsline letters, you'll see the drone images that comes up, but they are also measuring dissolved oxygen, ORP, pH, to provide an indication of how healthy the ponds are. So we do a lot of monitoring on the ponds anyway. And then we also have resource consent monitoring as well. So we measure what goes out the outfall into the receiving environment. And then we also have a number of groundwater monitoring bores as well, which measure the groundwater.
In terms of the monitoring of the outfall pipe, how often is that done?
I really should know this. I looked at it this afternoon. I'll provide that formally to you. It's regular.
Thank you.
And just on that, if you go onto our website in the quarterly reports, all the information is there available on the website as well. Back to the ocean outfall inception.
Right, we had a bit of a rush for questions near the end. Yanni and then Greg, and then we'll finish up with Kim. Yanni?
I just wanted to, has the ocean outfall liaison group been approached?
Not that I'm aware of.
Is it, I guess that leads into what's the process for engagement and communicating that, given that there's going to be significant public interest in this, and we've got a decision-making report coming in, what's it, like 10 days, or less than 10 days. What is the engagement communication process that will get views of stakeholders, interested parties?
If you provide the question, you'll have to get back to you on that one.
Right.
I'm unable to answer that now, I'm afraid.
And the final question for me was just, I mean, I love it when you give us the detail around different things that you're measuring around pond health, and you know this from previous questions I've asked. But just to have colours on a map, is there any way that we could actually give the levels of what we're measuring so people can see the trends? Like, is there a simple way in which we could, or a complicated way that could be made simple, where we could actually show the progress around pond health or the trend around pond health so people can kind of see where things are heading?
If you look at the history of odour incidents from the pond, it demonstrates that they are incredibly complex and biological beings, and trying to accurately predict, looking at the numbers as to whether the ponds are going to smell and how much are going to smell, or whether they're getting healthier stuff, is incredibly complex. So, hence why we go with a simple traffic light system, where each time you look at it, you're considering a range of 7 or 8 different factors and how they're all balanced out. And then using the engineer's intuition as to what we believe the pond health to be. So you can have it so that it's highly loaded, but if there's very high levels of algae, then it won't smell. If you have high loading in average algae, is it going to smell? The numbers don't really give you that much other than an indication.
So that was your final question. So Greg.
So kind of what you're saying with Yanni's question there is it's around a ratio between factors.
No. Our ability to predict when the ponds are going to smell is really hard, and it's really difficult. There's at times when I could have sworn blind the ponds should be generating quite significant odour and they're not, because all the parameters are saying the pond should be smelling and nothing's happening. And then you get other times when the algae is nice and high, the loading isn't particularly high, and then suddenly the ponds are smelling. Trying to understand the complexity of why they're smelling at different times is really hard, and that's why it's been really, really difficult to make accurate predictions of they're going to generate odour or not.
As part of the report, it's been talked about 30% as a amount to go through. Is there going to be any consideration of either smaller or larger quantities? So whether there's
I believe so, yes. Yes, I believe so. So looking at some of the documentation that I've seen, it does consider a different flow range and what the subsequent effects of load and reduction of the pond are.
In your opinion, if the outflow is put in place and the oxygen levels increase and smells are resolved, would the Would you look to continue using the outfall, or would you take it offline in those situations?
All the information will be provided in the report that's put to the councillors on that one. So, sorry.
Kim?
Thank you. Just going back a few years now, we had, remember the biblical portion of midges, and
Yes.
just wondering whether this situation is making a difference. Increase in midges at all.
There does seem to be a fairly inverse relationship between midges and odours. So if you have a bad year for odours, you tend to have a very good year for midges. If you have a good year for midges, you tend to have a
The other way.
Less odour.
Sorry, I was going to say good midges, but as in midges, yes.
So just that question is leading me into, because on the end at the moment, so this year there's about 300,000, which is what we were needing years ago for an operational budget. And I see in the next year's plan, it's reduced to 161. Just I should ask, how's that operational budget?
I'm not familiar with the exact numbers at this moment in time. I would know that the organisation has been supportive about allowing me to bring some of that spend forward to spend it in advance of future years. As I discussed at previous meetings, so if we've had the opportunity for additional plants or going over the budget slightly to allow some of the infrastructure improvements have gone in. So we'll have to look back and get those numbers to you.
So I'm just sort of alluding to the fact that it would be helpful if the budget for next year hasn't been reduced by a couple of thousand.
If we can take that question away, we'll get back to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Adam. Yeah, and I'm sure that there are many more questions that we'll have over the next week or so. We can send via Cindy.
If you could, so obviously I'm operations, so I only know a certain component of it. If you flick it through, we can make sure it goes to the correct community or legal or those people.
All right, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure we all agree. We don't want the plant to fail. We don't want it to stink, and we don't want to damage the environment. And all of those things are really important. And so we've got a difficult job on our hands. Yeah, thanks for all your work.
Thank you very much.
Keeping that plant running.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, that finishes the information session, and we'll just close with our again. Ia ki te uru tata nui, kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te whairua, I te ara takata, koe rā I rongo, koe kārea, ake ki. Kia tina, koe e, hai kia.